Hey everyone, here we are, chapter 21, If a Man Entice a Maid. This is definitely one of the most disturbing chapters. When people think of Mormons, they think of polygamy. That is one of the first things. What comes to your mind if you do a rapid word association and you think of Mormon? What comes to mind? Of course, if you're raised in the church, your answers are likely to be different than the general public, but I think of South Park. Getting your own planet, I think, is a pretty common answer for people that aren't in the church. Polygamy, the Book of Mormon. Yeah. Polygamy is definitely one that I think is most associated. In the entire narrative of American history as it's taught in the K through 12 public school system, the only mention of Mormons almost ever in all of the American history classes I've taken 3 since high school. So once in high school, and then I took AP US history again. So twice in high school, one of them being an AP class, and then I took an American history course and a world history course in undergraduate studies. And the only time you ever hear about the Mormons is in the section about the pioneers trekking west and manifest destiny. There's usually a paragraph about a sect of Christians living together in illicit polygamous marriage organizations who believed that they had a prophet and were led to travel along a winding trail across the Great Plains and ended up settling in what is now known today as the state of Utah. There's about a paragraph, maybe a page, maybe a blow up of some infographic information about Joseph Smith or Brigham Young, and that's about it. And then you just go back on to learning about the lead up to the American Civil War. And so usually one of the only things people will learn in government-sanctioned history lessons about Mormons is that they were pioneers and that they played a big role in the expansion of the Western frontier, and that they were known for their polygamous relationships. So this chapter talks all about that. It's interesting right away to talk about how Joseph calls this the blessing of Jacob. I think it's important to reference this because Fawn Brodie does not mince words. She makes it very clear that at the core of the polygamous movement in Mormonism is Joseph Smith. Instead of figuring out how to cover his sins of adultery, it's him being able to commit adultery in a way that does not cause guilt in his heart. Like myself, Joseph Smith was raised in an environment where purity is considered a virtue, and anything that would compromise your purity causes you to feel as though you will be stricken down to hell. Never in my life have I committed any sort of the sexual indiscretions that Joseph Smith is reported having done in this chapter and elsewhere throughout this book. But a big, huge problem in Mormon culture, even to this day, is the toxicity of purity culture, in which people, and specifically Mormon congregations, are taught because of the Book of Mormon that sexual indiscretion is a sin that is comparable to murder. It's basically the only thing God hates as much as killing innocent people is sleeping around outside of the bonds of matrimony. And so Joseph Smith, it's imperative for people to understand that is at the core of polygamy. It's that Joseph, as Fawn Brodie states it, and I tend to agree with Fawn Brodie. So Joseph Smith, at the core, wants to sleep with other women. He says right from the get-go, whenever I see a pretty woman, I have to pray for grace. They quote Exodus. If a man entice a maid that is not betrothed and lie with her, he shall surely endow her to be his wife. The sin of adultery lay not in the act itself, but in the subsequent desertion. It was the abandonment of the humbled maid that led to the unspeakable evils of prostitution and infanticide. So that's how Fawn Brodie writes that Joseph was. This is what they're seeing. It's really interesting how they participate in basically grooming an entire community. Usually when we use the term grooming, or at least in most of the instances I've seen it recently, it's being used to describe how an individual will use grooming behavior on another individual in order to manipulate them to a certain end, usually in a way that's extremely abusive and creates horrible trauma for the person being groomed. One example, like one less serious but like maybe serious example, is the rapper Drake has been accused of grooming people like Millie Bobby Brown, who is, at least I think she's still underage. She may not be, but at the time those accusations were coming up, he basically a grown man texting teenage girls, kind of weird stuff like that. So I think there is enough evidence from this chapter to conclude that grooming was kind of occurring at the community level with the polygamy. So the first thing that happens is that Joseph, they publish a pamphlet in the Times and Seasons, and the pamphlet is by Udney H. Jacob. I don't know if that's a pseudonym or not. Let's see. I don't remember if that's a pseudonym or if that's an actual person. Suffice it to say, Joseph was basically using another name, even if it was a real person, somebody other than himself, to put forth his claims. Again, Joseph Smith is the editor. So obviously, even if it's not his name, he allowed it to be printed in his editorial. And this pamphlet's so interesting. It says, a wife cannot be divorced, for a divorced man is not known in the whole canon of scriptures. It goes on, the idea of a woman taking a man to be her husband is not found in the Word of God, but the man marries the woman, and the woman is given in marriage. But the husband is not the property of the wife in any sense of the word. There is no positive law of God against a man's marrying Leah and Rachel both. To God only are men accountable in this matter, and not to their wives. So, one of the main apologetics for polygamy, or the way that it's spun in modern circles, so it's important for you to know, if you're not super keen on Mormon history, that basically for the majority of the 20th century, once polygamy was finally done away with in mainstream Mormonism, at least officially, in the later half of the 20th century, the arguments in church history textbooks were vehemently denying that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy. People conceded that Brigham Young was a polygamist, as how could you not concede it? It's as plain as day. But it wasn't until further light and knowledge came forth to really prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Joseph Smith was absolutely involved in polygamy and was the propagator of polygamy. Like, it didn't come from anyone else. It came from Joseph Smith. And one of the ways that so now that people concede that Joseph Smith did, in fact, have polygamous relationships with dozens, like not even just a few, like he literally married dozens of people. Can you imagine? One of the ways it's spun is by saying that the model of polygamy in early 19th century Mormonism serves as a useful bridge into our modern discourse on polyamory. If you don't know what polyamory is, what it means, polyamory is a term to describe ethical non-monogamy. Ethical non-monogamy or polyamory. I'm using those terms interchangeably. Someone can correct me if they're not interchangeable. My understanding is that polyamory refers to people who are consensually in multiple relationships at the same time, or are in an open, you may have heard people refer to as an open relationship, where you're in a committed relationship with someone, but casual hookups with other people, or even being in a committed relationship with more than just two people. So like 4 people living together and all of them are in a romantic relationship, the 4 of them instead of 2, stuff like that. A lot of apologists I've heard use this, they talk about polygamy in terms of it being like a 19th century precursor to the kinds of polyamory that are being more accepted in today's modern romantic landscape. And I think the criticism I have of that is the way that misogyny still plays is still at the core of the Mormon version of polygamy. Make no mistake, it's very much a patriarchal system in which men are to be granted their heart's desires if a man entice a maid, but there is no maid enticing the man. The women in this Nauvoo society are property first and foremost, and women can be given in marriage. At this time, a father is in charge, has so much of a greater say in who a daughter is allowed to or is given in marriage. And so it's just really disturbing to see the ways in which polygamy really disrupted Nauvoo and corrupted the hearts of the saints, especially through all of the secrecy in which it took place. Joseph Smith's defenders and apologists state that, who believe that the order to enact polygamy came from the heavens, state that God made it clear to Joseph that we had to be quiet, hush-hush about it, because milk before meat, the world wasn't ready for those doctrines. But as we read this chapter, it just is so clear that it really has nothing to do with God. So I thought it's interesting that they talk about the 10 talents. I'm sorry, I'm still sick, by the way, but I'm having so much fun recording these, I just can't help myself. So it talks about how if a man has one wife, then his rate of progression in the eternities is kind of like the default. But every wife a man has on top of his first wife it's like exponential growth. It's 1 man to the power of 7 wives, or if you're Joseph Smith, 1 man to the power of 36 plus wives. Brigham Young, 1 man to the power of 60,000 million wives, right? And so then it goes so far as to say that actually, now that we're doing polygamy, the man with only 1 wife would be denied even her in the eternities and forced to spend eternity as a ministering angel rather than a god. So that comes from Doctrine and Covenants, section 132. And this is still in canonized Mormon scriptures. Mormons say we don't practice polygamy anymore. This is not true. They don't practice polygamy in our current day and age in countries where polygamy is not legally allowed because of the very vibrant and violent history of how polygamy was officially oppressed by the United States government, and how Utah was not able to obtain United States statehood until they officially abandoned polygamy, and that was verified. So I believe it's true to say that if polygamy was not banned, and we have the Article of Faith number 11, Joseph Smith says we believe in allowing, or which is it 12? We believe in being subject to rulers, kings, and basically living the rule of the land. Mormons talk a big talk about being respectful to the laws of the land. But if polygamy was never banned, there is no reason that polygamy would have ever stopped. The only reason that there is discourse in 20th century Mormonism about polygamy no longer being allowed is simply because it was forced to stop. And there are multiple splinter groups of Mormonism that no longer accept modern mainstream Salt Lake City Mormonism because they wanted to keep practicing polygamy because of how strictly these doctrines were kept. So Mormons long story short, absolutely practice polygamy. Absolutely. They believe that in the next life, women who are righteous and didn't have the chance to be married in this life will be sealed to a worthy priesthood holder. And the doctrine has always been, the cultural explanation has always been that there are more righteous women than there are righteous men, and so there will be more women that make it to the celestial kingdom, which means, and if you believe that marriage between man and woman is required for the highest level of eternal progression, well, there's going to be women that are sealed, multiple women sealed to one man. So don't get it twisted. The current prophet of the Mormon Church is sealed to more than one woman, meaning when he dies, if the Mormon view of the world and reality is true, then Russell M. Nelson is a polygamist. And this concept of spiritual wifery, which is a term that was used even back in Nauvoo times, spiritual wifery exists in modern-day Mormonism. In Salt Lake Mormonism. The next in line to be the prophet, if Russell M. Nelson dies today, would be Dallin H. Oaks. And he also is practicing spiritual wifery. He has more than one wife that is sealed to him. So, and I know this from experience because I have been married in a Latter-day Saint temple and have been divorced from that marriage. That a man can be sealed to more than one woman, and if a woman wants to get sealed to a man other than her first marriage, then she has to get the sealing annulled. She cannot be sealed to more than one man. We talked in the last chapter about how Mormonism is a way of life, and I think that this is true here as well, with this idea of once the prophet says that the cultural norm is for polygamy to exist, then everyone, suddenly it's not just like God approves polygamy, it is like you cannot be exalted without polygamy. So Mormonism is totally a way of life. I think Mormonism is based in optimistic naivete, where people just have even if you have problems with the doctrine, most people in my family and other people I've heard on my mission and things like that would say, oh, well, we don't have the answers here, but we'll get all the answers in the next life. And so they just go on about their lives, optimistic, ignorance is bliss sort of a thing. A lot of Mormons are really committed to secular social justice and get involved in politics, and that's really admirable. But it's not because, most people, I wouldn't say it's uniquely because they're Mormon. It may be because their Christian ethic they believe Jesus Christ as an example of social change. But I wouldn't say there's anything unique about Mormonism that compels people to be good citizens. There's the kind of the saying that gets thrown around, everything good about Mormonism is found elsewhere, and there's nothing there's nothing uniquely good about Mormonism. Yeah, I messed up the saying, but you know what I'm trying to say. Yeah, I think Mormonism is this period in Nauvoo is a really interesting period to learn about how Mormonism operates today in sort of this cultural virus, if you will. It spreads, and everyone's doing it. It's cool, man. It's like I said previously with the fantasy football. It's, oh, well, if Brother Joseph has 10 wives, then we ought to jump on the same train. He's the prophet of God after all. So, and it says, it will be seen that the Mormon heaven was as changing, tumultuous, and infinitely varied as earth itself. Isn't that the truth? One of the main things you will hear over the pulpit time and time again, almost every general conference, is that the times change, but the truth, the everlasting truth of God is unchanging. And this is such an absolutely Orwellian affront to the true historical narrative of Mormon doctrine. Even from the first publication of the Book of Mormon, which had a Trinitarian doctrinal standpoint on the Godhead. And now one of the defining aspects of Mormon theology is that they reject Trinitarian doctrine. And so, you cannot say that that truth changes. Similarly with polygamy. You go from monogamy is the only approved by God way. Suddenly they start reading the Old Testament and realize, oh my goodness, Abraham and Jacob had concubines and wives. Well, there's no reason that if the patriarchs in the Old Testament can do it, why can't we? And then suddenly they get a revelation in the 20th century, or the 1890s or whenever it was, saying, okay, polygamy's done, wink, wink. No, it's not. And then they did a second public revelation in which they said, okay, polygamy is actually for real done this time. Like, no take backsies. It's for real done. There's just, like, I could go on and on. But this doctrine of heaven that's expanding, I think there's a lot of really good things about a theology that's willing to adapt and grow. And I think that's why Mormonism is still alive at all. Of course, the numbers of Mormonism are failing drastically, and COVID has not helped with that at all, of course. But yeah, the truth is always changing. Like, it is never not changing, and Mormonism will continue to adapt. If Joseph Smith and Brigham Young, specifically, if Brigham Young saw the state of the church today, he would castigate everyone. So I'm not going to say much about the famous story of the Joseph Smith with the Mary Elizabeth Rollins and the angel threatening. So an angel comes to Joseph Smith and says, you must take this woman as a plural wife or I will strike you down. Again, there have been entire essays and scholastic articles written about this event in Mormon history. It's a really famous. If you've never encountered any like anti-Mormon literature, one of the first things you will hear if you've only ever read church-approved sources is people will go, "Oh, didn't you hear about that time Joseph Smith had an angel tell him to?" In any case, the apologetics for that are really, really dismal. I do not envy the folks at Fair Latter-day Saints trying to answer how God would be okay with that sort of behavior. Fawn Brodie is really careful to go about talking about how polygamy became culturally necessary for many women due to the disparity between the genders in Nauvoo. And one thing that is really important to mention is that I've mentioned previously about the converts from England that trafficking was occurring, and that is true. These women were coming, they're destitute, they're promised that if they come from England thousands of miles to the western frontier of the United States, there will be a land of milk and honey in abundance. They get there, they're destitute, they have no land, no property, no inheritance, nothing. And someone says, "Oh, I can solve that problem for you. Just go marry this 60-year-old man." And that's a really sad thing. The Relief Society gets set up. It's one of the pettiest organizations ever known. So hilarious if it weren't so seriously tragic. It says, eventually every one of the women in the leadership of the Relief Society became Joseph's plural wife, with the exception of Mrs. Whitney, who granted him instead the privilege of marrying her 17-year-old daughter Sarah. Yuck! Can you imagine being so engrossed in this religion that not only would you give yourself up to a man knowing that his wife does not know that he is boinking her entire social group? I mean, it's just crazy, you guys. Like, how could you defend this dude? Like, the last chapter we talked about how Joseph Smith was a puzzle and that he's an enigma and an interesting character to study. But, like, when you read this chapter, it's just like, come on. He was sleeping and committing adultery with, like, every person that Emma Smith would have called a friend. Didn't tell Emma. Yeah, if you read Doctrine and Covenants 132, it's really tragic. I don't remember if it talked about it here, but we do know that in the history of the Relief Society, there was an affidavit swearing that they were not practicing polygamy, signed by like at least a dozen of the women who were already secretly married to Joseph Smith. So that's pretty funny. The story, I highlighted the entire story of Martha Brotherton, this woman who gets locked in the back room or whatever by Brigham Young, and Brigham and Joseph corner her and try to persuade her into a polygamous arrangement. And she says she's so smart, and says, hey, I just need a second to pray about it. Allow me to go home and ponder so that I can receive this truth for myself. And then she leaves. I think it says did they leave that night? They left immediately. Her family left, and they published the story in the newspapers. It's amazing to me that Joseph Smith, again, is just able to slither his way out of this. It's amazing the spell that these people in Nauvoo were under. This story, when I read it 2 years ago, when I was first reading this book as a newly ex-Mormon, this story of Martha Brotherton escaping the predatory behavior of Brigham Young, this made my blood boil. This is inexcusable. Again, talk about there not being any good apologetics. This is a truly awful instance of misogynistic abuse from men in power to a teenager. She's a teenager, right? I think she's an 18-year-old girl with men twice her age cornering in her room and trying to dominate her emotionally and physically. This is just totally sickening. And I think it's so interesting. I've realized that that's one of the things I say the most in these commentaries. Is I think it's interesting, or I think it's important to say. I'm sure there are many other little vocal tics that I've developed, but that's definitely one of them that I've noticed. So Joseph Smith says in his defense, which is successful, and like apparently no one seems to be super up in arms about this, a man is saved no faster than he gets knowledge. Now, that's important to me because that is a quote that I heard so much on my mission, and I've heard it in General Conference. Like, this is a really important foundational truth taught by Joseph Smith, is that a man is saved no faster than he gets knowledge. Gordon B. Hinckley was a prophet leader of the Mormon Church in the 90s and early 2000s who hugely stressed the importance of education. Brigham Young University, I've heard people call it the Harvard of the West. That is a joke. As someone who has attended a school that is much better than BYU academically, I can confidently say that BYU is not the Harvard of the West. But at any rate, they value education so much, and I just think it's so ironic that the source of this quote about a man is saved no faster than he gets knowledge is a horrible gaslighting attempt to convince the saints of Nauvoo that him and Brigham's horrific assault on Martha Brotherton, emotional assault, I should say, not physical, their emotional assault on Martha Brotherton, this is his piss poor attempt to defend himself, and he ends up freshly minting a brand new theological gem that generations of Mormons would chew on. Something to think about. It's a real bitter truth at the center of a sweet tasting gospel. The next chapter is chapter 22, and we're going to learn about one of the greatest betrayals in the history of Mormonism from one of Joseph's closest confidants. And this really is where the book is heading towards. The next 5 chapters, I think there's only 5 chapters left, and we're going to be getting into how Joseph Smith got from basically being a king beloved by his entire city to being assassinated in a brutal assault on his life. And it's just, I can't believe how fascinating this book has been. I hope you enjoyed it. We'll see you next time.